What's going on, guys? It's Chris here with the by Christ podcast. I'm so happy to be back on here. It's been forever since we've done an episode. This week, we're trying to just do a solo episode where we're going over the significance of James, all 5 chapters of James. There's going to be 5 episodes we're dropping this week. Today's going to be chapter 1 of James, and kind of just going through like a whole bunch because, personally, every book in the Bible is important, but I feel like, James shows really a significance in a lot of people's lives, not just mine, but a lot of others that I've seen. But, you know, as you're going through James, it talks about ways to be a better Christian and kind of just living a better Christian life instead of the way that we live normally. Because I know that I know personally from my experience, I've lived in a worldly way as a Christian. And I know whenever I read through James, it just shows a lot, and I feel like it's really important. Personally, for me, I love James. One of my favorite books, besides Matthew. Matthew will always be my favorite. But James shows a lot of significance on how to be better. So today we're just going to be reading through James 1, and I will be stopping a lot because I have a whole bunch of notes that I'm going to be doing. So just bear with it. Um, yeah, so let's get started, guys. James chapter 1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So we're going to kind of stop there, ran through two through 4, and this just talks about having, we're having trials in our faith. We're going to be tested, but these tests are for a good thing because it's the testing of your steadfastness for God. Um, and like steadfastness just means your following of Christ, your walk with Christ. But trials aren't what shapes you. Trials are what's testing you. God is what shapes you. You have to know that you're being shaped, and you have to go through all these trials to be shaped. Um, God's like we're going to talk about it later, but we're not going to talk about it right now. But you're going to be tested, and it's just something that happens in your walk. You have to be tested. Um, and a point that I had for this was, have we made Christianity comfort over growth? And I think that in the short term is yes, but in a long term, you know, I think we choose a lot of comfort because we think that's what Christianity is, that God just comforts us. But to grow, you have to go through pain. To grow, you have to go through this uncomfortable stage. To grow, you have to go through this and that. Um, I know for a long time before I wanted to do this podcast, I had not spoke, but I used to do this stuff in my school where I would lead a Bible study, and that was the most uncomfortable thing in my life, having to speak in front of a whole bunch of kids my age. That was not fun, but it's something you have to step out of your comfort zone. You have to grow in that, and you're going to be tested with this stuff. So you can't just sit in a religion and you feel comfortable because the walk is not going to be comfortable. And it's like this saying, the road to hell feels like heaven, but the road to heaven feels like hell. So you have to go through all this stuff to have that comfort in the end. You can't have the comfort now because you're going to suffer later. You have to suffer now and have the comfort later. So I like those. I like that point. I feel like besides what we're going to be reading about later, this is a big part of James chapter 1. So let's go into this next one. It says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without apologize, reproach. There we go. And it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. Um, so I kind of just a point that I had here was separating from knowledge and wisdom. Now, knowledge is knowing something. Knowledge is, I know this, I know that. You can have knowledge in school, you can have knowledge in world stuff, but there's a knowledge in God too. But then wisdom is knowing how to apply the stuff. The wisdom is being able to acknowledge and apply the stuff. So, um, kind of a point that there was that a lot of Christians have the knowledge of the Bible, but very few have, not very few, but many Christians don't like to have the wisdom and apply it to their daily lives. I know I struggled with that for a long time. I didn't, I would read it, but I wouldn't apply it to myself. So I would preach it to others, but I wouldn't apply it to myself. And, we can't live like that. We have to live in God's ways and not our own ways. Um, Another thing is why do we struggle to trust God's answer? Um, or another point to add to that, why do we struggle with what God tells us? Because, I think that whenever you're getting your prayers answered, there's three things that God will say: yes, no, or wait. And nobody likes hearing no and wait. Because, why would we want to hear those things? Because, I mean, we don't, a lot of us don't have the patience, but you have to have the patience as a Christian. You have to be able to have the patience for God's answers, but we also have to know that the answer will be no. Because, like, when you're praying, I've heard somebody pray over a Fortnite game before. Help me win this Fortnite game. God's not going to answer that prayer and say yes. But there's things that, we also have to acknowledge, because when we want somebody, when you think of somebody in the hospital, we want, like, oh God, heal this person, strengthen this person, or, just heal them. And it might not be the answer that we want. When we think of healing, we think of, he's walking again, or he's breathing right again. But God's might be healing on the other side, where he takes this person away and having healing on the other side. That's not an answer that we want to hear, but it's God's answer. And, I think that just shows the significance. And where it says in verse 8, it says, he is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. What James means by this is living double-minded, where you are living as a Christian, but also living in a worldly way. And that was kind of just, pointing back to the knowledge versus wisdom part, where you can't live like a Christian but then not apply the wisdom into our lives. And I think that just shows a big significance. I'm kind of just going to skip down over to, we're going to skip from 9 through 12, and we're going to go straight to 13, where it says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has convinced, given birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, being forth death. Um, so I think that I have a few points that's coming from this, but it says we blame God for our mistakes. That was one of our points. Why do we blame God for our mistakes? Um, I think that's kind of just what we jump to automatically, when we're like, God, why did you let this happen to me? Um, like when we end up somewhere that we're not supposed to be, why did you let this happen to me? And, you know, we blame God for us, like, well, God's tempting me right now. God's not going to tempt you. Like it says right here, God's not going to tempt you because God can't be tempted, so he wouldn't tempt any other. Um, we have to acknowledge that we ourselves are falling into the temptation by the enemy. It is our job to not fall into these temptations. Now, I had this little not graphic, but this little graph that we had where it says desire goes into temptation, temptation goes into sin, and sin eventually leads to death. Ooh, sorry if I might all sinused up, but sin leads to death. Now, um, so desire or no, um, Sin doesn't begin with the actions, but it begins with desire. Sorry, guys, I'm all over the place right now. So sin doesn't begin with actions, but it begins with desire. To be tempted, you have to desire this stuff. Um, so I mean, you're still gonna be tempted, but if you're not, if your desire isn't focused on what that is, but your desire is focused on God, then you'll fall less into those temptations. That I feel like that's a good point. I'm sorry, guys. Um, so I feel like this is showing a really great importance. So now let's skip down to 19, where it says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive meekness, the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." Um, I think that not just Christians, but everybody needs to hear this. Well, especially as Christians, because this is Paul writing to the Christians, or not Paul. Whoo, Paul's all in the New Testament. James is writing to the Christians about this because this is we are like so quick to react to something that we don't process this, so we're just out of an instant reaction we're angry at something, or we just speak out of our head. So as Christians, we have to think for a second. You have to just sit there and think, like, what is my reaction going to be to this? So you have to have a good reaction. You can't be angry at someone. Like, so say a non-Christian walks up to you as you're a Christian. A non-Christian walks up to you and they're saying all this stuff, like, they're cussing at you. They're saying things about God that you don't want to hear. So if you jump back at them in a angry way, or a way that we shouldn't act as a Christian, then they're going to see that, and it's going to be you know a bad representation of who you are and who God is, because you're led by God. If they see this, then they're going to think that God's a bad person. So we have to be slow to these things that we do. Um, so now let's go to the other one. This is going to be the biggest part of what you're reading today, um, or what we're reading today. It's James 22. "But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceive yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing." That's a mouthful. But um, you have to not only be a hearer, but you have to, I like what it said earlier. It ties back perfectly to what we were talking about, having the knowledge versus having the wisdom. Um, you can't only be a hearer of God's word, because, you know, if you're just hearing it and you're not applying it, then how are you supposed to live? Like, how are you supposed to live as a Christian? Because we can say that we go to church, but we don't live in a way that is, we're living the saved life. We're living the the life that a Christian is supposed to live, the biblical ways. And I think a lot of people just want to put the title of a Christian on, and they go to church and they just listen, but then they go right out into the real world and they're going to live a life that they're not supposed to. You have to act on this stuff. What you're putting into your head, not what you're putting into your head, but what you listen to from the word, you have to apply it, because as a Christian, um, your get out of hell free card isn't supposed to be like this. Being saved is you believe this stuff and you still listen to it, but you have to act on it. You have to do the stuff the Bible says, like the the laws. You have to follow this stuff, because I'm trying to get my train of thought. You have to apply this stuff, because it's faith without works, and I think that that's in the next episode, faith without works is dead. You can't just hear this and not apply it, and you think that you're a Christian, because that's not how a Christian's supposed to be. Um, so we got a few more verses, and then that's the end of the episode. Um, if anyone thinks he's religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep one's unstained from the world. So that's kind of just um, the first chapter of James. I feel like that, besides chapter 2, is really important in the book, because kind of just like, it just throws it right at you instantly as you're reading the book, all this stuff that you need to do. But I mean, all of James is really good. All of the Bible is important. But like I was saying earlier, it is it just shows like a really good significance of what a Christian's supposed to live like, and new Christians what they're supposed to do. So um, I pray that you apply this to your life. Um, that you're not just taking this as something that, oh, I'm just listening, but because it's my friend. But I want you to actually like apply this and be able to know all this stuff, because it's really important. As a Christian, this is really important, and I pray that if you're not a Christian yet, that this is something that is going to just ache at you, not a bad ache, but just ache at you, because I want this to be for everyone. Everyone deserves Christ. So I just pray that if you're not a Christian, this is something that is just heavy on your heart. Um, Thank you guys so much. I pray that y'all's day goes good. And thank you guys so much for listening and watching. Thank you.